animals, I'll be happy to take them at the end of the tour. And we currently have 3 of our main foxes in this enclosure. So this first one here is Flo, our main vixen or female. Now she's quite an elderly fox, 13 years old now in actual fact, a very good age for a fox in captivity, which is why she's a little bit rough around the edges, along with her going through her summer molt. So she's molting out that thick winter coat, as you can see, particularly towards her back end, and getting that nice, sleek, shiny coat ready for the summer, as the weather starts to warm up. And she is, as mentioned, one of 3 foxes in here, along with 2 males or dog foxes called Dobby and Ted. Now they're all rescues or born here in captivity. So Flo, for example, is a rescue from the wild. She was found 13 years ago as a tiny cub abandoned out in the wild, and she was then brought in by a local family and reared up by that family, who happened to have some pet dogs. So she's grown up thinking she too is a dog. So that's why she can take food from my hand, quite happy to take that. And as well some cuddles as well, some tickles behind the ear. Pretty much like having a pet dog at home, which is why she is here with us. They did try to release her back out into the wild, but she kept coming to the front door every night expecting food. And so she's, as mentioned, ended up here with us instead. Now Ted's similar story, he was reared and rescued from the wild, and that was 6 years ago now, so slightly younger than Flo. And then Dobby, who is quite old again, 12 years old, actually one of Flo's cubs. He was born here in the centre, and ironically quite shy and secretive, even though he was reared by Flo here. But if you're here towards the end of the day, that is when they get a little bit more active, and you may well see them coming out for their dinner. But if not, over to your left hand side and my right, over the other side of the path there, we've got a separate enclosure with 2 more foxes, again rescues, and they are called Basil and Mortimer. And Mortimer is very excitable. He's like the younger version of Flo. He's just a year old in fact, so I'm sure you'll catch a glimpse of him getting excited to see people. And the last place that you can see foxes, linked to this enclosure in fact, is in our barn section. So there's a dip in the ground here, it runs underneath the path you're stood on, links into the barn. So if you walk through there later and see a fox inside, do not be alarmed at all. I assure you they are free to come and go as they please. Flo just spends a lot of time in there if the weather's bad, or indeed if she thinks she can get a cuddle from people again. But the mating season for a fox occurs in the winter, and at which stage a female or a vixen like Flo here is fertile for just 3 days. So she has to communicate that to the male by issuing the famous scream that keeps us awake throughout those winter months. And it sounds like someone being murdered, not very nice at all. And that just communicates out to the male, and they come together, and a couple of months later have usually 4 or 5 cubs. Now that will vary depending on resources about, so the record's actually 12 cubs in a litter, but usually they would have about 4 or 5. And they're born with very dark fur, so a dark brown to black colour, very similar to the tips of their ears and feet. So with Flo here, for example, that rich dark colour on their feet, also the tips of their tail, potentially from birth. And that dark colour just aiding with their camouflage whilst they're underground for that first month of their lives, and then as they begin to emerge, gradually turning orange, but the tips of their feet and ears obviously do remain black. It'll be about 6 to 9 months later that those cubs are big enough, old enough to venture out into the wild on their own and find new territories for themselves. Although sometimes they do stay behind, they will take on a so-called auntie role and outraise the young of the following spring. So certainly the female cubs can stay behind and help their mum out for the following year. Now in terms of the home that they do use, it's called an earth, and usually an abandoned rabbit or a badger set. No need to do any more work than you have to if you're a fox, quite lazy in that sense. Happily going under some decking or in an old shed in the towns and cities too. Anything that is easy to them. But if they are forced to build their own home, it would be similar to the one in this enclosure. So around to your left hand side again, on the other side of the tree line there, we've got a steep bank, giving them lots of soil to dig into. Good for drainage that way, lots of entrances going into that. And that's where Dobby spends the majority of his time in fact. So if you're going to catch a glimpse of him, it's usually a bit later in the day and usually around the corner there. And quite unusual for a mammal in the UK. They are generally monogamous too, so they will, or certainly potentially, will mate for life. So even though the male and female can split up throughout the year, generally speaking, in the winter they come back together to mate and then rear the young together as well. So usually with our mammals, the male will mate with the female and then leave her to it. They quite happily go their separate ways, but in this case, the dad takes an active role in helping to rear the cubs. And that's generally in terms of finding food. So that first month or so when the cubs are born and hiding underground, the vixen, the mum, can afford to spend most of that time underground with them. And in the meantime, it's down to the dog or the father to get the food for himself and the family. He will go out on his own. They are solitary hunters, so you wouldn't see them hunting in packs like you would wolves, for example. And this is Ted down here, by the way, who's just ventured out. And if given the option, they are technically classed as carnivores, so they'll be looking for their meats first. The likes of rabbits, chickens, smaller mammals, birds and amphibians as well. But realistically, foxes, again, taking the easy option. They're highly adaptable. They're quite happily eat nuts, seeds, fruits, berries, earthworms, insects as well. They have that omnivorous diet, leftover pizza, Chinese from the night before, not fussy whatsoever. They rummage through our bins or have that reputation for finding leftover food. So we try and replicate that here at the centre. We give them a varied diet. Right now they're just getting a few dog biscuits as a bit of a snack. Later on it could be that they get some more dog food for their main meal, wet and dry food. Could be that they get some rabbits, some quail, some chicken, some venison, some fish. Or it could be that they get leftovers from the coffee shop, all mixed up in moderation. That varied diet, and they will then bury it away underground for when times are a bit harder. They cache their food away for when they are a bit more hungry. But as mentioned, highly adaptable, finding food in pretty much any habitat across the UK. Heathlands, woodlands, moorlands, grasslands, to name a few. The coast, even in towns and cities as well. Pretty much any habitat could have a red fox living there, and they're widespread across the world as well, so showing how adaptable, how successful they are. So naturally that does lead to their threats too. They come into close proximity to us and to each other. Certainly in the urban areas where they are more densely populated, where we are as well. So they will spread diseases and parasites amongst themselves, for the likes of mange in particular, quite rife in our urban fox population. They are still considered a pest by many as well, sadly, so they are still persecuted.